They looked at her standing among elite soldiers and saw only a female soldier. In those eyes, respect for women had faded long before she ever spoke. Beside her stood a Navy SEAL and his German shepherd, silently witnessing it all. They whispered that she didn't belong in a place this unforgiving. What they didn't know was that her calm, intelligence, and resolve could save every life there. And the Navy SEAL and his dog were the first to recognize that truth. Before the story begins, tell us where you're watching from, like and subscribe. Every follow helps us share more meaningful stories like this. Arrived clean and unforgiving. Cold light slid across the snow like a blade, turning old drifts into pale mirrors. The world looked honest in that light. Nothing hidden, nothing softened. Every sound carried farther. Every breath showed. Nolan Creed sat alone at a corner table inside a roadside cafe just off the highway, his shoulders squared by habit, his posture relaxed only because he allowed it to be. At 35, he moved like a man who had learned how to take up exactly the space he needed, and no more. He was tall, a shade over 6 feet, with a lean, compact build that spoke of endurance rather than display. His face was clean-shaven, the skin roughened slightly by wind and cold. A square jaw set firm beneath pronounced cheekbones gave him the look of a man permanently braced against impact. His hair, dark brown, cut short in a military style just a touch longer than regulation, caught the light when he shifted, revealing flecks of silver frost where snowmelt had kissed it earlier. His eyes were gray-blue, steady and unhurried. They did not search the room. They did not judge it. They simply observed, the way someone does when they have already seen worse than whatever is in front of them. At his feet lay Coda. The German shepherd was 5 years old, black and tan, with a sable pattern that darkened along his back like a shadow stitched into fur. His body was long and athletic, built for movement rather than bulk. His ears stood alert but relaxed, one tipped just slightly forward, as if he were always listening to something Nolan couldn't quite hear. Coda's amber eyes were open, not staring, watching. The cafe smelled of burned coffee and hot bread. Somewhere behind the counter, a woman laughed, a short, tired laugh that belonged to someone who woke before dawn too often. A pair of truckers spoke quietly near the window. Cutlery clicked. The heater rattled. On the wall above the counter, a flat-screen television played the morning news. Nolan had not been watching it. He rarely did. But when the anchor's tone shifted, when that practiced calm sharpened by half a degree, his attention rose without effort. Federal authorities confirm that a group of armed fugitives has disappeared from active surveillance overnight, the anchor said. She was in her 40s, composed, hair pulled back tightly, the kind of woman who spoke tragedy without letting it touch her voice. Officials believe the suspects may be moving north. Residents in northern counties are advised to remain alert and report any suspicious activity. The footage changed. Blurred aerial shots, red circles, a map with arrows pointing upward. Nolan's gaze flicked to the screen for no more than a second, long enough to register, not long enough to engage. He took a sip of coffee. It was too hot. He didn't react. "This isn't ours," he murmured under his breath. "More a habit than a belief." Coda reacted. The dog lifted his head fully now, ears rising into sharp attention. His gaze locked onto the screen, muscles along his shoulders tightening just enough to ripple the fur. He did not growl. He did not bark. He simply watched. Nolan noticed. He always did. "You hear something?" Nolan asked quietly, resting his boot against the table leg so the vibration would carry down. Coda didn't look at him. The dog's tail slowed, then stilled completely. That was unusual. Coda was not skittish. He had been around gunfire, crowds, chaos, and silence that pressed down hard enough to break men. He did not startle easily. When he reacted like this, alert without panic, it usually meant one thing. Something had changed. The news moved on. Weather. Sports. A smiling couple promoting discounted tires. Coda's ears lowered slightly, but he didn't relax. Nolan watched him for another second, then reached down and rested his hand briefly on the dog's neck. Solid. Warm. Real. "Not our job today," Nolan said again, this time more firmly. Coda blinked once. The moment passed, but not completely. They finished their coffee and stepped back into the cold. Outside, the air bit clean and sharp. Snow crunched under Nolan's boots as he crossed the lot toward his truck. The sky was pale blue, the kind of color that made everything feel exposed. Pine trees lined the road in disciplined rows, their branches heavy with frost. Nolan wore the same clothes he always did now, a worn olive-gray tactical combat shirt, soft with age and faded slightly at the seams. The cuffs were frayed. The shoulders bore the quiet scars of time and weather. Beneath it, a red thermal layer showed at the collar when he moved. His combat pants, brown earth mottled with green, were scuffed at the knees, the cargo pockets sagging faintly from years of use. His boots were old military work boots, leather creased, soles thick and reliable. On his wrist sat an old military watch, scratched but steady, ticking time forward whether he noticed or not. Coda trotted beside him, leash loose. His breath fogged the air. They drove north. The road curved gently, flanked by snowbanks and stretches of forest that seemed untouched by time. Nolan let the radio play softly. Nothing important, just noise to keep the silence from becoming heavy. He thought about the day ahead. The Air Force Museum sat on a low rise outside town, a clean structure of steel and glass framed by open ground. Nolan was meeting Marcus Hale there, an old colleague turned consultant, someone who understood both the history and the mechanics of the aircraft Nolan would soon be training around. The upcoming air assault leadership course wasn't ceremonial. It was practical, demanding. The kind of training that stripped people down to decision-making under pressure. Nolan welcomed that. Structure made sense. People rarely did. The museum came into view just before noon. Jets rested on display outside like frozen predators, noses lifted skyward. The wind carried a faint metallic tang, mixed with old oil and cold earth. Nolan parked in the designated lot and clipped Coda's leash firmly. "You stay sharp," he told the dog, kneeling briefly to look him in the eye. "I won't be long." Coda tilted his head, eyes intent. His tail gave one slow wag. At the security gate, Staff Sergeant Ben Caldwell waited. Caldwell was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked perpetually wind-burned. His beard was trimmed close, more out of convenience than style, and his eyes held the patient irritation of someone who had spent years enforcing rules he didn't write. "Creed," Caldwell said, nodding. "You know the drill." "Yeah," Nolan replied. "He stays outside." Caldwell crouched slightly to look at Coda. "You behave," he said to the dog, tone half joking, half serious. Coda stared back, unblinking. Caldwell straightened. "A dog's got eyes like he knows things." Nolan almost smiled. "Watch him for me," Nolan said. "Got it," Caldwell replied. "He'll be fine." Nolan handed off the leash and turned toward the museum doors. Behind him, Coda sat, didn't lie down, just sat, watching. Inside, the museum was quiet in a way that felt intentional. Light filtered down through glass panels, illuminating aircraft suspended mid-air like relics of old gods. Nolan walked past them slowly, the echo of his boots softened by polished floors. Marcus Hale met him near the rotorcraft exhibit. Marcus was a few years older than Nolan, leaner in a way that suggested long hours bent over schematics rather than carrying rucks. His hair had thinned at the temples, his glasses perched low on his nose. He dressed like a man who belonged half in the field, half behind a desk. Dark jacket, worn boots, hands perpetually smudged with graphite or oil. "Creed," Marcus said, smiling. "Still look like you could disappear into the woods and not come back. Still look like you'd try to fix a helicopter with a pencil," Nolan replied. Marcus laughed. "Come on, I've got what you need." They walked together, talking shop, rotor wash, load limits, failure points. Nolan listened more than he spoke, filing details away the way he always had. Outside, unseen, Coda shifted. The dog rose from his seated position and turned toward the road. His ears pricked high. His body went rigid. For a moment, just a moment, his attention snapped toward the distant highway, where the wind carried a sound too faint for human ears. Something moved. Something wrong. Coda let out a single low whine. It was brief, controlled, not fear. Warning. Ben Caldwell glanced down at him. "Hey," he muttered. "What is it, boy?" Coda didn't look at him. His gaze stayed fixed north, toward the road, toward whatever had not yet arrived. Inside the museum, Nolan felt it then. Not fear, not certainty, just the subtle tightening behind the ribs that came when pieces refused to lie flat. He paused mid-step. Marcus noticed. "You good?" "Yeah," Nolan said after a beat. "Just—" He stopped himself. Just what? Just a feeling wasn't something he said out loud anymore. "Let's keep going," he finished, but the sense lingered, as if the clean northern light had shifted, only slightly, and something unseen had stepped into its path. Cold air carried sound farther than it should have. Outside the Air Force Museum, the wind slid across open concrete and grass stiff with frost, humming softly against the steel bodies of retired aircraft on display. The sky was wide and pale, the kind of blue that made every movement feel exposed. Coda waited near the edge of the pedestrian walkway, leash secured to a low steel post just inside the marked boundary. He lay sphinx-like at first, forelegs extended, chin lifted, eyes tracking the world with quiet intent. His black and tan coat caught the light in bands, dark along the spine, warmer gold at the legs and chest. The fur at his neck was thick, built for cold, and stirred each time the wind passed. He was still alert, but calmer now. Time passed in small increments. Footsteps, doors opening and closing, the murmur of voices from inside the museum. A few visitors crossed the lot, families with children bundled into bright coats, an older couple walking slowly, hands linked as if afraid the cold might steal one away. Coda's ears rotated gently, cataloging sound. Then he stood, not abruptly, not alarmed, just attentive. Across the street that ran between the museum grounds and the parking area, the pedestrian signal glowed green. A woman stepped off the curb. She was elderly, perhaps in her late 70s, her posture bent not by frailty, but by years of habit. Her coat was wool, dark blue and heavy, cinched at the waist with a belt that had seen better decades. Wisps of silver hair escaped from beneath a knit hat, pulled low over her ears. In one gloved hand, she carried a paper cup of coffee. In the other, a folded brochure from the museum gift shop. She walked carefully, eyes on the ground, counting each step. The light changed faster than it should have, Green flickered. Yellow. Red. At the same moment, a bicycle rounded the corner at speed. The rider, a young man in his 20s, lean, athletic, cheeks red from the cold, wore a thin jacket and headphones that sealed him off from the world. His eyes were forward, locked on momentum, not the crosswalk. He didn't see the woman until it was too late. Coda moved. The leash snapped taut as he surged forward, muscles bunching beneath his coat. He didn't bark. He didn't hesitate. He crossed the boundary of stillness and action in a single, fluid decision. The bicycle skidded. The rider swerved. The woman stumbled, startled, the paper cup tilting sharply in her hand. Hot coffee arced through the air. It splashed across Coda's foreleg. The dog yelped, once, sharp and surprised, and planted himself between the woman and the bike, shoulders squared, stance firm. The cyclist clipped the curb and tumbled sideways, more shaken than hurt. The woman gasped, dropping the brochure, both hands flying to her chest. Oh my God," she said, voice thin with shock. I didn't. Coda's paw lifted instinctively. His breathing quickened. Steam rose faintly from the wet fur at his leg. People converged. Someone swore under their breath. Someone else asked if everyone was okay. The cyclist pushed himself upright, face flushed with embarrassment and pain, headphones dangling loose. "Are you hurt?" a woman called. "I'm fine," the cyclist muttered, already apologizing, words tripping over each other. The elderly woman sank down onto the low curb, knees unsteady. Coda stood over her protectively despite the pain, head lowered slightly, eyes alert. Then another presence joined the circle. She moved in fast, efficient steps, cutting through the small crowd without raising her voice. Her name was Juniper Hale. She was in her early 30s, average height, with a compact, athletic build that suggested endurance rather than strength. Her dark hair was pulled into a low, practical bun at the nape of her neck, not a strand out of place. She wore a slate-gray jacket zipped high against the cold, gloves already halfway off as she knelt. Her face was calm, focused in a way that pushed noise to the edges of perception. Her eyes were a cool, hazel gray, steady and assessing, not unkind, but not given to reassurance either. She went first to the woman. "Ma'am, can you look at me?" Juniper asked gently, her voice even. "Did you hit your head?" The woman shook her head, breath hitching. No, I don't think so. It was just so fast." Juniper nodded once. "Good. Stay seated for a moment. You're safe." Then her attention shifted to Coda. He had gone still now, teeth clenched, ears slightly back. The wet fur on his foreleg darkened where the coffee had soaked in. Juniper reached out slowly, letting him see her hand before she touched him. "Hey," she murmured, low and steady. "Easy, big guy." Coda met her gaze. Something passed between them, brief, wordless, and he didn't pull away. Juniper examined the leg carefully, fingers precise, assessing heat, skin, reaction. "It's a surface burn," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "Painful, but not deep." She opened a small pouch at her hip, compact, well-worn, and withdrew a sterile cloth. With controlled movements, she cooled the area, wrapped it, secured it. Coda trembled once, then steadied. His tail thumped the concrete. Juniper glanced up at that, a flicker of something like approval crossing her face. "You're brave," she told him softly. The woman on the curb reached out, trembling, to touch Coda's shoulder. "He saved me," she said. "He ran right out." Juniper nodded. "He did." The cyclist hovered nearby, contrite. "I didn't see her. I swear." "I know," Juniper said. "Slow down next time." Her tone made it less a reprimand than a fact. The woman's coffee lay spilled, the cup crushed beneath a boot someone had moved without thinking. Juniper helped the woman to her feet, checking her balance. At that moment, Nolan Creed broke into a run across the open ground. He crossed the distance in long, controlled strides, coat flaring slightly with the movement. His eyes locked immediately on Coda, on the wrapped leg, on the woman standing shakily. His chest tightened. "What happened?" he asked, breath steady despite the sprint. Juniper looked up at him. "Your dog stepped in front of a bike," she said. "Took the heat instead." Nolan crouched beside Coda, hands moving over familiar fur, careful of the bandage. "You okay?" he murmured. Coda leaned into him, tail wagging once. Nolan looked back at Juniper. "Are you a doctor?" Juniper shook her head, already packing her kit. "No." "Medic?" She hesitated, just a fraction of a second. "I have some experience." There was a quality to her answer Nolan recognized, precise without invitation. He nodded. "Thank you." She stood, brushing cold from her knees. "He should be fine. Keep the wrap clean, watch for swelling." Nolan absorbed every word. Juniper turned then, offering a brief smile to the elderly woman, who squeezed her hand in gratitude. "Take care," Juniper said. Then she walked away. No name given. No expectation of thanks. Coda watched her go, ears perked, tail wagging low and steady. Nolan stood there for a moment longer than necessary, the wind tugging at his jacket, the museum doors opening and closing behind him. As Juniper disappeared into the flow of people near the entrance, Coda did something Nolan had never seen him do before. The dog let out a single, soft huff, almost a sound of recognition, and then sat, facing the direction she had gone, utterly still, as if marking a point on a map. Eventually, the crowd thinned. The cyclist left, walking his bike. The elderly woman was escorted to a bench by a museum attendant, still shaken but smiling now, her fear receding. Nolan checked Coda's leg again. The dog endured the touch without complaint, eyes warm. "You did good," Nolan said quietly. Coda's tail thumped once. Nolan retrieved the leash, his hand lingering at the collar longer than usual. Inside the museum, time moved on. Exhibits waited, conversations resumed. But something had shifted. Nolan glanced once more toward the entrance where the woman had vanished, a name forming in his mind without context or permission. Not curiosity, recognition. Then he turned back toward the doors, unaware that the line he had just crossed would soon pull tight around all of them. The training compound sat at the edge of the forest, where the land flattened just enough to make room for concrete pads, hangars, and long stretches of open ground marked by faded paint and boot-scuffed gravel. Pines ringed the perimeter like quiet sentries, their dark needles whispering whenever the wind shifted. Morning came early here. The cold was different than it had been near the museum, sharper, more intentional, the kind that cut through fabric and found bone if you let it. Frost clung to metal railings. Breath rose in pale clouds and vanished almost instantly. Nolan Creed arrived just after first light. He parked, stepped out, and paused for a moment to let the quiet settle. The place smelled of fuel, damp earth, and cold steel. Familiar, comforting in a way that surprised him. Coda jumped down from the truck with practiced ease, landing softly despite the wrapped foreleg. The bandage was clean, snug, and already dusted with frost. The German shepherd shook once, then looked up at Nolan, ears forward, eyes bright. "You're sure you're good?" Nolan asked quietly, crouching to check the wrap again. Coda stood patiently, tail wagging once, low and controlled. His posture was steady, alert, but not strained. Nolan straightened and clipped the leash. They walked together toward the administrative building where check-in was underway. Men and women in various shades of green and gray moved across the compound, some carrying gear, others sipping from insulated mugs. Voices were low. Laughter was rare and brief. Everyone here understood what the next days would demand. At the edge of the training zone sat a fenced-off area marked K9 Support. Staff Sergeant Ben Caldwell waited there, hands shoved into the pockets of his heavy jacket. He looked tired already, the way men do when responsibility starts before dawn. "Morning, Creed," Caldwell said. His beard was frosted at the edges. "Heard about yesterday." Nolan nodded. "He'll sit out the course." Caldwell crouched, eyeing the bandage. "Looks clean. Dog's tough." "He always is." Caldwell reached out slowly, letting Coda sniff first. "You'll be safe here," he told the dog, voice calm. "I'll keep an eye on you." Coda studied him for a long moment, then sat. Nolan handed over the leash. As he turned away, Coda rose halfway, as if to follow, then stopped. He remained standing, watching Nolan's back until distance and duty closed the gap. Nolan felt the pull of that gaze longer than he expected. Inside the main briefing hall, the air was warmer, thick with the smell of coffee and canvas. Folding chairs filled the space in loose rows. Helmets, packs, and harnesses lay stacked against the walls. Nolan found a seat near the middle and sat, posture relaxed but attentive. Conversations drifted around him. "Heard the load times are brutal this cycle. Last course broke 3 people by day 2. They don't care how good you are, only how fast you adapt." A man 2 seats over leaned back and smirked. "Anyone here they've got a woman in this class?" The tone was casual. Too casual. Another voice answered, lower, amused. "Yeah? Wonder how she got in." A few quiet chuckles followed. Nolan didn't look over. He stared at the scuffed floor, jaw tightening just enough to notice. He'd heard variations of that sentence in too many places, too many years. It wasn't always malicious. Sometimes it was habit, sometimes insecurity, sometimes both. A tall man with broad shoulders and a trimmed beard leaned into the aisle, arms crossed. His name patch read, Morris. He had the look of someone who filled rooms easily, confident, loud, without effort. "Doesn't matter," Morris said. "Course weeds people out fast." Nolan exhaled slowly through his nose. The doors at the front of the hall opened. Conversation died almost instantly. A senior officer stepped inside, followed by a small group of instructors. The man at the front, Lieutenant Commander Holt, was lean, angular, his hair clipped close, his face set in permanent neutrality. He moved like someone who wasted no motion. "Find a seat," Holt said. His voice carried without effort. "We're starting." Everyone sat straighter. Holt scanned the room once, eyes sharp. "This course exists for one reason," he continued. "To see how you operate when the ground is gone and the air doesn't care who you are." A few faces tightened. "You will be tired. You will be frustrated. You will fail something you thought you were good at." He paused. "That's the point." Then he gestured toward the side door. "Step in." The door opened again. She entered quietly. Juniper Hale. She wore the same slate-gray outer layer Nolan remembered, zipped high, gloves tucked into a pocket. Her hair was pulled back in the same low bun, dark and unadorned. Her posture was straight, shoulders relaxed, head level. She didn't look around. She didn't need to. Nolan recognized her immediately. The room shifted. Eyes tracked her movement as she took a seat near the front, folding her hands loosely in her lap. Her expression was neutral, unreadable. A few heads leaned together. Whispers flickered and died. Holt spoke again. For those of you who care about numbers, this class includes one female candidate. The word female landed flat, clinical. She earned her place the same way you did. Holt's gaze swept the room. You'll treat her accordingly. Juniper didn't react. Nolan felt something in his chest ease and tighten at the same time. The morning passed in briefings, paperwork, equipment issue. Names were called. Gear was assigned. Instructions repeated until they became muscle memory. By midday, the class was released for a short break. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of snow from deeper in the forest. Nolan headed toward the K9 area without thinking. Coda was on his feet before Nolan reached the fence. The dog's tail wagged hard now, joy unmistakable. His ears were forward, eyes bright, body leaning into the fence as far as it would allow. "You're doing fine," Nolan said softly, crouching to rest his forehead briefly against the mesh. "I'll be back before you know it." Coda pressed his nose to Nolan's knuckles, breathing him in. A shadow fell across the ground. Nolan looked up. Juniper stood a few steps away, hands tucked into her jacket pockets. She looked different here, under the open sky. Smaller, somehow, but not less solid. The wind lifted a loose strand of hair at her temple. Her face was calm, but her eyes softened slightly when she saw Coda. "How's the leg?" she asked. Nolan blinked once, surprised. "Healing, thanks to you." She nodded. "Good." Coda whined softly and wagged his tail harder. Juniper crouched just enough to meet his eye line, careful not to crowd him. "You did a good thing," she said, "but try not to do it again." Coda tilted his head, tongue lolling briefly. Nolan cleared his throat. "You left pretty fast yesterday. I didn't get a chance to thank you properly." Juniper stood. "You did." "I thought you were medical," Nolan added. "Army, maybe." Something unreadable crossed her face, gone almost as soon as it appeared. "People assume a lot," she said evenly. From behind them, laughter broke out, Morris's voice unmistakable. "Guess they really let anyone in these days." A few others chuckled. Juniper didn't turn. She didn't stiffen either. She simply rested her weight evenly on both feet, eyes forward. Nolan felt heat rise behind his eyes. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no clean words in that moment, only the awareness of how easily intention could turn into intrusion. Juniper gave Coda one last glance, a faint curve touching her lips. "See you around," she said. She walked away without waiting for a response. Nolan stood there longer than necessary, hand resting on the fence, listening to the wind move through the trees. Coda watched her go, tail slowing, ears tracking until distance swallowed her. As Nolan turned back toward the building, Coda suddenly froze. Not alert, not excited, still. The dog's gaze fixed on Juniper's retreating figure. Not her exactly, but the ground just ahead of her boots. Coda let out a low, unfamiliar sound, somewhere between a huff and a whine. Then he sat, perfectly upright, as if waiting. The break ended. Whistles blew. Instructors called them back. Nolan walked toward the hangar with the others, thoughts heavy and unsettled. The line had not been drawn yet, but he could feel where it would be. The wind rose before the machines did. It swept across the training field in long, cutting gusts, dragging the cold up from the ground and pushing it under collars, into sleeves, against skin already stiff from the morning. The sky above the compound was pale and high, washed thin by winter light. The sun a distant disk that gave illumination without warmth. The helicopter sat on the pad like a patient animal, rotors still, body dark against the concrete. Its presence changed the air around it, made voices quieter, movements more deliberate. Nolan Creed adjusted the straps of his pack and felt the familiar pull settle into his shoulders. The weight was significant, designed to test not strength alone, but balance, judgment, and restraint. He rolled one shoulder, then the other, letting his muscles remember the shape of the load. Around him, the class prepared in near silence. Boots shifted on gravel, buckles clicked, gloves were tightened and retightened. No one rushed. Everyone knew that rushing here was a way to fail early. Juniper Hale stood a few paces away, her back to him as she checked her own gear. The pack on her shoulders looked heavier than most, its straps cinched tight against her jacket. She moved with economy. No wasted motion, no visible strain. But Nolan noticed the way her shoulders set a fraction lower when she leaned forward, compensating. He didn't think. He stepped closer. "That one's loaded heavy," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "You want a hand getting it up?" Juniper turned. Up close, her face showed the effects of the cold more clearly now. Skin pale but unblemished, jaw set, eyes sharp and alert. A faint line ran from the corner of her mouth toward her cheek, not a scar so much as a crease earned by habit, by concentration. For a brief moment, she simply looked at him. Then she reached back and caught the strap of her pack and pulled it away from him. "I can handle it," she said. Her voice wasn't raised. It wasn't sharp, but it was final. "I know," Nolan said quickly, the words tumbling out before he could weigh them. "I just meant—" She met his eyes. "I can do everything you can do," Juniper said. "Don't assume otherwise." The sentence landed clean and heavy, like a dropped tool. Nolan felt heat rise in his face, a sudden rush of awareness, of how easily intention could be misread, how old habits didn't always belong in new contexts. "I didn't—" He stopped, exhaled. "I wasn't assuming." Juniper didn't argue. She didn't explain. She turned back toward the aircraft and stepped forward, boots crunching on gravel as she took her place in line. Nolan stood where he was for a second longer, hands flexing at his sides. Around them, the class began to move. The instructors called them up one by one. Each trainee approached the helicopter, clipped their pack to the rigging, and stepped back as the load was tested. The process was precise, almost ritualistic. Mistakes were corrected quietly. No one was coddled. No one was praised. When it was Juniper's turn, she didn't hesitate. She stepped under the frame, lifted the pack smoothly, and clipped it in place with a single, efficient motion. The load pulled hard, tugging her forward for a fraction of a second, but she compensated immediately, stance widening, knees flexing. The instructor nearest her, a compact man with close-cropped hair and a face like weathered stone, watched closely. "Stable," he said. "Move." Juniper moved. Nolan followed 2 slots later. As he clipped in his own pack, he felt the familiar rhythm return, the mental narrowing that came when variables reduced and the body took over. This was a language he understood. They boarded in sequence. Inside the helicopter, the space was tight and loud. The smell of fuel and oil hung heavy, layered with cold metal and the faint scent of sweat trapped beneath gear. Red interior lights cast everything in muted shadow, turning faces into masks. Juniper sat across from Nolan, knees braced, pack secured between her boots. She didn't look at him. He told himself not to read into that. The rotors began to spin. At first it was a low thrum, more felt than heard. Then the vibration increased, shaking through the floor, up through boots and bones. Conversation died entirely as the noise filled the cabin. Nolan rested his gloved hands on his thighs and focused on his breathing. In, out. Across from him, Juniper's gaze was forward, unfocused in the way of someone listening, not just with ears, but with their whole body. The helicopter lifted. The ground dropped away, slow at first, then decisively. The sensation tugged at Nolan's stomach, familiar and grounding all at once. He adjusted his balance automatically, shoulders loose, spine aligned. The exercise unfolded as briefed. Signals, checks, controlled movement. Everyone performed well. Too well, perhaps. As the helicopter circled back toward the pad, the wind shifted again, stronger now, pressing hard against the fuselage. The aircraft dipped slightly, corrected, then dipped again. Nothing dramatic, but enough to sharpen attention. Juniper's pack shifted. Not much, just enough to pull her weight forward at an awkward angle. She adjusted, boots scraping, hands reaching for the nearest hold. The helicopter lurched. Juniper lost her footing. Nolan reacted without thought. He lunged forward, catching her by the harness before gravity could finish the equation. The jolt carried through his arm and into his shoulder as he braced, muscles locking to absorb the force. Juniper sucked in a breath, surprise flickering across her face before control reasserted itself. "I've got you," Nolan said into the roar. She nodded once, regaining her stance. "I'm good." He released her immediately, stepping back to give space. The moment passed as quickly as it had arrived, but something had shifted. The rest of the flight was steady. The helicopter touched down cleanly, rotors slowing as dust and frost swirled around the pad. They disembarked in silence. Back on solid ground, the cold seemed sharper. Juniper loosened her pack straps and rolled her shoulders once, testing them. Nolan watched without meaning to, noting the way she shook out tension before it could settle. She turned toward him. "Earlier," Nolan said, before he could overthink it. "I wasn't trying to." "I know," Juniper said. Her voice was calmer now, less guarded. "I've had people try to help me my whole career," she continued. "Some meant well, some didn't. It's hard to tell the difference when you're under load." Nolan nodded slowly. "I get that." She studied him for a second, as if deciding whether to say more. Then she shook her head slightly. "Doesn't matter. We did the work." "Yes," Nolan said. "We did." She turned away, conversation closed. From the far side of the compound, a sharp bark cut through the wind. Coda. Nolan turned instinctively. The German shepherd stood at the fence of the K9 area, forelegs planted wide, body rigid. His ears were pinned forward, eyes fixed on the helicopter pad. Not on the people, on the aircraft. Coda barked again, short, urgent. Caldwell rushed toward him, calling his name, but Coda didn't move. He didn't snarl. He didn't panic. He watched the helicopter with the intensity of something that sensed a pattern before it formed. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the barking stopped. Coda sat and waited. The instructors called them back into formation. The day's evolution. The helicopter lifted again in the early afternoon, the sound of the rotors flattening the air into something dense and metallic. Snowmelt streaked across the pad and vanished beneath the skids as the aircraft climbed, nose dipping slightly into the wind. The light had changed since morning, still bright, but sharper, edged with cloud that moved too fast for comfort. Inside the cabin, the temperature dropped quickly. Cold slipped in through seams and joints, finding skin and settling there. The smell of fuel and oil grew heavier as the engines worked harder, a layered scent Nolan associated with motion and risk. He took his seat along the forward bulkhead, pack wedged beneath his boots, harness clipped and tugged once, hard to confirm it would hold. Habit. Always habit. Across from him, Juniper Hale sat with her knees braced, hands resting loosely on her thighs. The slate gray of her jacket looked darker under the red interior lights, almost blue-black. She didn't fidget. She didn't scan the cabin the way some did when nerves crept in. Her focus was inward, as if she were listening to a rhythm only she could hear. Nolan felt the subtle vibration change as the pilot adjusted power. The helicopter banked, turning toward the foothills that marked the edge of the training corridor. The ground below shifted from concrete and cleared earth to a patchwork of forest and frozen streams. Weather moved faster up here. Clouds slid in low, dragging thin curtains of snow behind them. Wind buffeted the fuselage in uneven pulses, not strong enough to be dangerous yet, but enough to keep everyone alert. Nolan adjusted his balance automatically as the aircraft shuddered, muscles responding before thought. He glanced once at Juniper, then away, careful not to read meaning where there was none. The flight had been briefed as routine. Routine, Nolan knew, was a word that lost its value the moment conditions changed. The radio crackled in the cockpit. Short bursts of clipped voices Nolan couldn't fully hear over the engine noise. The helicopter dipped again, corrected, then steadied. Juniper's gaze sharpened. She shifted slightly, boots pressing harder into the floor, posture aligning with the movement of the aircraft. Something in her expression changed. Not fear, not surprise, recognition. Nolan felt it then, too. A pressure behind the eyes, the subtle tightening that came when the air itself seemed to lean closer. The helicopter crossed into a narrow valley. Trees rose higher here, dark and close together, their tops swaying unevenly. The wind funneled between the slopes, turning unpredictable, pushing against the aircraft from angles that demanded constant correction. The pilot compensated smoothly. Then a sound cut through the engine roar, a sharp, unmistakable crack. The helicopter lurched violently to the left. Someone swore. Another crack followed, closer this time, and the cabin filled with the smell of burned metal. "Taking fire!" the crew chief shouted from the open side door, voice barely audible over the alarms that began to scream. The aircraft bucked again, harder, throwing Nolan forward against his harness. He gritted his teeth and forced his breathing to stay steady. Juniper was on her feet before anyone called for her. She moved with purpose, clipping her harness to an overhead point as the helicopter pitched. Her hands were already pulling supplies from a compact medical pouch secured at her hip. A man near the rear, one of the trainees Nolan didn't know well, slumped sideways, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder. Blood pooled, slick and fast, catching the red cabin light and turning it almost black. Juniper knelt beside him, one knee braced, the other sliding slightly as the floor tilted beneath her. "Stay with me," she said, voice calm and firm. "Look at me." The man's face was pale, jaw clenched against pain. He nodded once, breath hitching. Juniper worked quickly, tourniquet out, looped high, cinched tight. Her movements were precise, practiced, as if her body had memorized the sequence long ago. Nolan shifted closer, bracing himself against a support strut as the helicopter dipped again. He watched her hands, noting the lack of hesitation, the way she compensated automatically for the movement of the aircraft. Another round struck the fuselage. Sparks flew near the cockpit, briefly illuminating the cabin in harsh white light. The helicopter lost altitude. "Engine temps climbing!" someone yelled. The aircraft shuddered, rotors screaming louder as the pilot fought to maintain control. Juniper glanced up once, just once, eyes flicking to the cockpit, tracking gauges she couldn't see but clearly understood. Then she returned her focus to the wounded man, guiding his hand to press where she needed pressure held. "Breathe," she told him. "Slow. You're doing fine." The wind slammed into the open side door, sending a blast of freezing air through the cabin. The helicopter yawed sharply. Juniper lost her balance. Nolan was already moving. He caught her by the harness again, planting his boots wide, shoulder driving into the bulkhead as he absorbed the force. The jolt traveled through him, rattling teeth and bone. Juniper steadied herself, fingers gripping his forearm for a brief second before she let go. "Thanks," she said, clipped but sincere. He nodded once. No words wasted. The helicopter dipped again. Lower now, the treetops rushing up faster than Nolan liked. The radio erupted in overlapping voices. The pilot shouted something Nolan couldn't hear. The alarms changed pitch. Juniper finished securing the tourniquet and shifted to the next injured man, movements never slowing, never panicking. Nolan felt the edges of the situation closing in. Not fear, but the narrowing focus that came before decisions had to be made. The helicopter dropped sharply, then leveled out just above the tree line, skimming air thick with snow and debris. Outside, muzzle flashes flickered briefly between the trees. Then they were gone. The valley widened abruptly, opening into a rough clearing marked by stone walls and frozen ground. The pilot brought the helicopter down hard, skids scraping and bouncing once before settling. Silence crashed in after the engines powered down to idle. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then training took over. "Out! Perimeter!" Holt's voice cut through the haze. The doors were shoved open. Cold air flooded the cabin as the trainees poured out, rifles up, spreading into practiced positions. Juniper stayed inside long enough to secure the wounded man to his seat, then moved to the next, checking airways, tightening bandages. Nolan took position just outside the door, scanning the tree line. The helicopter rested in the clearing like a wounded animal. Its skids were half buried in frozen soil, one angled slightly off true. The fuselage streaked with soot and shallow scars where rounds had struck and glanced away. Heat bled from the engines in slow waves, carrying the sharp smell of burned metal and fuel into the cold air. Snow drifted sideways, thin and dry, hissing against armor and exposed skin. Nolan Creed held his position near the stone wall at the edge of the clearing, rifle steady, eyes moving in deliberate arcs. The world had narrowed to angles and distances, tree line, shadows, gaps where someone could appear if they were brave or desperate enough. Behind him, the wounded lay where they had been dragged from the aircraft, bodies wrapped in jackets and harnesses, breath fogging the air. Juniper Hale moved among them with quiet efficiency, checking pulses, tightening bandages, murmuring instructions that carried calm like weight. She looked different now. Not outwardly, her posture was still straight, her movements controlled. But there was a sharpness to her focus that hadn't been there during training. Something had locked into place. Lieutenant Commander Holt stood near the nose of the helicopter, helmet off, face drawn tight. The wind tugged at his collar, but he didn't seem to notice. He stared at the cockpit as if willing it to answer him. "Status," he said. The crew chief, Staff Sergeant Owen Klein, crouched near the open door, hands braced on his knees. Klein was mid-30s, compact and wiry, his hair shaved close and his jaw shadowed with stubble that never quite went away. His eyes were sharp but tired, the eyes of someone who trusted machines only as far as they behaved. "Primary hydraulics took a hit," Klein reported. "Secondary's gone. Right engine's running hot. Controls are sloppy." "How long can she hold?" Holt asked. Klein shook his head slowly. Not long. Not if we try to lift heavy. Holt exhaled through his nose, the sound barely audible under the wind. He keyed his radio, listening as static filled his ear. No response. The second helicopter had pulled off under fire. Higher command was out of reach. The valley swallowed signals the way it swallowed sound. They were alone. Juniper finished securing the last bandage and stood, rolling her shoulders once as if shedding tension before it could take root. She wiped her gloved hands against her jacket and moved toward Holt. "The wounded are stable," she said. "For now." Holt nodded, eyes still on the aircraft. "Can we get airborne?" Klein didn't answer immediately. He looked at the gauges again, then at the sky, then back at Holt. "Not safely," he said. "Not like this." Silence settled over the clearing, heavy and absolute. The wind hissed through the trees. Nolan felt it then. The tightening that came when a situation refused to resolve itself, when choices narrowed to edges sharp enough to cut. Holt turned slowly, scanning the group. His gaze passed over faces streaked with dirt and cold, over eyes alert and waiting. "Who here can fly?" he asked. No one spoke. The question hung in the air, absurd and deadly serious all at once. A few men exchanged glances. Someone let out a short, humorless breath that might have been a laugh under other circumstances. Klein looked down at the ground. Nolan's mind ran through options automatically: perimeter, movement on foot, distances to the nearest extraction point. None of them were good. All of them carried risk that compounded with every minute they stayed. Then Juniper stepped forward. The sound of her boots on frozen ground was soft, but unmistakable. "I can," she said. The words were quiet, unadorned. For a heartbeat, no one reacted. Then Morris let out a sharp breath. Disbelief etched across his face. "You're kidding." Juniper didn't look at him. Holt turned fully now, studying her for the first time since they'd hit the ground. "You've flown before?" he asked. "Yes." "When?" "A while ago." "What platform?" Juniper paused, just long enough for Nolan to feel the weight of the moment shift. "Army helicopters," she said. That was all. No rank, no unit, no explanation. Holt held her gaze, searching for something. Doubt, bravado, fear. He found none of it. Behind them, one of the wounded groaned softly. Juniper glanced back, reflexive, then returned her attention to Holt. "I won't promise more than the aircraft can give," she said, "but I can try." Klein stared at her, then at the cockpit. "You realize what you're saying," he said. "This bird's barely holding together." "I know," Juniper replied. "That's why we don't push it." Holt's jaw tightened. He looked at the helicopter, at the valley walls, at the darkening sky. Then he nodded once. "Get in the seat," he said. "Price, you talk her through what you can." Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Price, the pilot who had taken the hit, lay propped against a pack near the door, his left shoulder bound tight. He was late 40s, lean, with a face carved by years of sun and stress. Pain lined his eyes, but his mind was still sharp. "She's right," Price said hoarsely. "She knows what she's doing." Juniper didn't respond. She moved. As Juniper climbed into the cockpit, Nolan caught a glimpse of her forearm where her sleeve rode up, just for a second. There was a pale, rectangular patch of skin near her wrist, sharp-edged, unmistakable, a tan line, the kind left by years of wearing the same flight gear in the same place. Juniper slid into the pilot's seat with a familiarity that made Nolan's chest tighten. She adjusted the pedals, hands moving with confidence born of repetition, not theory. The cockpit lights flickered weakly as she powered systems up in sequence. "Battery," she said aloud, more for herself than anyone else. Fuel pumps. Klein watched her hands, disbelief creeping into his expression. You're reading that fast. I'm not reading, Juniper said. I remember. She toggled switches, checked pressures. Her head tilted slightly, as if listening. Hydraulics are bleeding off, she continued. That's why the pedals feel loose. Primaries are still giving partial pressure. Klein stared at the gauge. She was right. We'll lose yaw authority if it drops further, he said. I know, Juniper replied. I'll compensate as long as it holds. If it doesn't, we set her down immediately. Price forced himself more upright. She's good, he said through clenched teeth. She flew smooth back then. Juniper didn't acknowledge him. Holt leaned into the doorway. What do you need? Weight reduction, Juniper said. Anything not critical. Holt hesitated for half a second, then nodded. Do it. Ammo boxes were dragged out and stacked near the wall. Extra packs were stripped and tossed aside. Water jugs rolled across the ground. No one complained. Juniper watched the weight come off, then turned back to the panel. A PU start, she said. The auxiliary power unit whined, then caught, vibration traveling through the airframe. Her hand moved to the starter. The engine coughed. Temperature spiked. Stop, Juniper said instantly, releasing the switch. Give it a second. She waited, counted silently, then adjusted 2 controls and tried again. The engine sputtered, then roared unevenly to life. The rotors began to turn, slow, heavy. Dust and snow stirred around the skids in lazy spirals. Juniper brought the power up in increments so small, Nolan could barely see the movement. The helicopter shuddered. The skids lightened. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the aircraft lifted an inch. 2. It wobbled, threatening to tip. Juniper corrected, jaw set, eyes never leaving the gauges. Hold it, Holt said. I am, Juniper replied. The engine temperature crept higher. She eased back slightly, then forward again. We need a flatter spot, she said. That orchard behind the wall. Less than 100 meters. Holt looked toward the trees beyond the stone wall, dark and dense. Do it. Juniper nodded once. She eased the collective forward. The helicopter lurched into motion, skimming low over broken ground. Rounds cracked in the distance. Wild, panicked. Juniper ignored them. Her world narrowed to vibration, pressure, and the faint outline of trees ahead. She flared gently. The skids hit hard. The aircraft stayed upright. Juniper chopped power. The rotors slowed. Silence rushed in. No one spoke. They simply stared at the cockpit, at the woman climbing out of the seat as if she'd only gone for a short drive. Enemy fire began snapping into the outer wall seconds later. The moment had passed. The fight was back. The orchard was smaller than it had looked from the air. Rows of leafless trees stood in uneven lines, their branches clawing at the low gray sky. Snow lay thin and patchy across the frozen ground, broken by old irrigation trenches and the dark scars of vehicle tracks long since abandoned. The stone wall at the orchard's edge offered partial cover, enough to matter, not enough to feel safe. The helicopter sat at the center of it all, rotors slowing, metal ticking as heat bled away. It looked fragile now, stripped of motion, like a creature that had spent its last burst of strength to get here. Enemy fire snapped into the outer wall within seconds. Sharp cracks echoed across the orchard, rounds chewing into stone and dirt. Chips flew, snow puffed up in quick, violent bursts. "Contact! West tree line!" someone shouted. Nolan Creed dropped behind the wall instinctively, rifle up, body moving with the economy of long habit. His breathing settled into the familiar cadence that came when chaos narrowed into purpose. He scanned the tree line. Dark trunks, shadows layered on shadows. Movement flickered, then vanished. Behind him, Juniper Hale was already in motion. She didn't run. She moved quickly but deliberately, stepping around the helicopter's skid and dropping to one knee beside the wounded pilot, Daniel Price. Her gloved hands were steady as she checked his bandage again, tightening pressure where blood still threatened to seep through. Price's face was drawn tight with pain, but his eyes were clear. "You stayed upright," he said, voice hoarse. "My nice flying." Juniper didn't look at him. "Don't waste breath," she replied. "You need it." She shifted to the next casualty, a young Afghan partner fighter who had taken shrapnel to the leg. He was maybe 20, lean and sharp-boned, his dark hair matted with sweat beneath a knit cap. His eyes were wide, fear fighting discipline as blood soaked through his trousers. Juniper knelt beside him, speaking softly in simple English, her tone calm enough to slow his breathing. She applied a tourniquet, cinched it tight, then reinforced it with gauze torn cleanly and efficiently. Around them, the firefight ebbed and surged. Nolan leaned out from cover and fired 2 controlled shots toward a cluster of movement near the trees. The recoil grounded him, his world reduced to sight picture and trigger press. Between bursts, he stole a glance toward Juniper. She was everywhere at once, hands working, eyes tracking, body always angled so she could see both the wounded and the perimeter. She wasn't issuing orders, but people responded to her presence anyway, shifting to give her space, adjusting positions without being told. Lieutenant Commander Holt crouched near the wall a few meters away, radio pressed to his ear. His face was hard now, lines etched deep by concentration. "No response," he muttered. Still nothing. The orchard felt smaller with every passing second. Snow drifted sideways, stinging exposed skin. The cold bit harder now that adrenaline began to ebb at the edges. A civilian voice rose suddenly above the gunfire. A shout. High. Panicked. Nolan froze for half a heartbeat. From the gap in the stone wall stumbled an elderly man, half carrying, half dragging a child toward the clearing. The man was thin, stooped, his beard white and untrimmed, eyes wild with fear. The boy in his arms couldn't have been more than 10, small, limp, his pant leg torn open and soaked dark with blood. They collapsed just inside the wall. Juniper was already moving. She slid in beside them, pulling the boy gently toward the cover of a low tree. Her hands were on him before Nolan had time to shout a warning. "What's his name?" she asked the old man, voice steady despite the rounds snapping overhead. "Youssef," the man gasped. "Please, please." "I've got him," Juniper said. She cut away the fabric with a swift motion. Metal fragments glittered briefly in the wound before blood welled up again. Juniper's jaw tightened. She reached into her medical pouch, paused, then reached deeper. Her hands came out empty. For a fraction of a second, a blink, no more. Something crossed her face. Calculation. She had used more supplies than she realized in the air and after landing. What remained was limited. 2 pressure bandages, half a roll of gauze, no pain medication. She didn't say a word. She applied the tourniquet high on the boy's leg, tightened it until the bleeding slowed, then leaned close so Youssef could hear her over the gunfire. "You're okay," she said. "Stay with me." The boy cried out, pain raw and unfiltered. Juniper didn't flinch. She adjusted pressure, working with what she had, hands moving fast but careful. Behind her, Holt scanned the perimeter again, mind racing through options. The radio crackled. Then a voice broke through at last. Possible bird inbound in 15. Not guaranteed. 15 minutes. In this place, that was a lifetime. Holt looked down at the boy, then at Juniper. "We move when we get a break," he said. "We push on foot." Juniper looked up at him. "What about him?" she asked, nodding toward Yusuf. Holt hesitated. The answer was written across his face before he spoke. "We can't carry everyone." "I know," Juniper said. "He won't survive the move yet." The old man clutched at her sleeve, eyes desperate. Juniper met Holt's gaze, unwavering. "I'll stay until he's stable enough," she said. "Then we move." The orchard seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment where rank usually decided things, where commanders overrode. Holt looked at the wounded boy again, then at the line of trees where enemies still hid, then back at Juniper. "Ridge," he called out. Senior Chief Hanlon, gray-haired, broad, eyes sharp with decades of service, was beside him instantly. "2 men stay with Doc," Holt said. "We hold here until she says move." Hanlon nodded once, no hesitation. He moved to Juniper's side, rifle angled outward. Nolan shifted position without being told, covering the approach from the west. His jaw clenched tight. This was leadership, he realized. Not volume, not authority. Just judgment under pressure. As Juniper worked, Yusuf's small hand closed weakly around her sleeve. She froze for half a second, then covered his hand with her own. Her voice dropped even lower. "I'm here," she said. "You don't let go." Something in her tone wasn't medical. It was personal. The firefight came in waves. At first scattered shots, probing, then overlapping bursts, rounds snapping through branches, thudding into trunks. Dust and snow hung thick in the air. Nolan fired in controlled rhythms, reloading smoothly. Awareness stretched thin but steady. Time blurred, stretching and compressing in strange ways. Juniper continued working. When Yusuf's bleeding slowed enough, she reinforced the bandage, checked his pulse again. The old man hovered close, murmuring prayers Nolan couldn't understand. At last, the sound of rotors cut through the chaos. A helicopter roared in low and fast, taking fire on approach but pushing through. The downdraft flattened the orchard, snow and debris swirling into a blinding storm. "Move!" Holt shouted. The wounded were loaded first. Daniel Price was lifted onto a litter, face pale but alive. Yusuf was wrapped in a blanket and carefully passed into Juniper's arms for the short run to the aircraft. She carried him as if he weighed nothing. Inside the helicopter, the noise swallowed everything. The door slammed shut. They lifted. The flight back was silent. Exhaustion settled deep into Nolan's bones, the kind that bypassed muscle and went straight for the core. He watched Juniper cradle Yusuf, murmuring softly as the boy drifted in and out of consciousness. When they landed, med teams surged forward, taking over with practiced urgency. Yusuf was rushed toward surgery. Price disappeared behind canvas flaps. Juniper stood there for a moment longer than necessary, watching until she was sure someone stayed with the boy. Then she turned away. Nolan saw her later at the medbay sink, scrubbing dried blood from her hands. Holt stood nearby, tablet in hand. "I'm updating your file," Holt said. "Cross-training, aviation as secondary capability." Juniper kept washing. "That won't be necessary," she replied. Holt studied her for a long moment. "You don't decide what this team can use." She turned off the water and nodded once. "If there's nothing else, sir," she said, "I need to restock my kit." She walked past him without waiting for a response. Outside, the sky was lightening, dawn creeping in quietly, without ceremony. Nolan found her near the edge of the pad, jacket pulled tight, breath fogging the air. "Hey," he said. She turned. "Do you want a ride back?" he asked, then added almost awkwardly, "My dog insists I thank you properly this time." For the first time since he'd known her, Juniper smiled. Small, tired, real. Sometimes the miracle is not the absence of danger, but the presence of the right people at the exact moment they are needed. Sometimes God does not stop the storm. He places a steady hand inside it, a quiet heart, a soul willing to stand when no one expects them to. In battlefields and in ordinary streets, in moments of fear and in moments of choice, grace often arrives without announcement. It looks like courage. It sounds like calm. It feels like someone refusing to walk away. If this story moved you, perhaps it is because you have felt something similar in your own life. A moment when help came unexpectedly, or when you were called to be that help for someone else. May God watch over you wherever you are. May He protect your loved ones, guide your steps, and give you strength when the path feels uncertain. If this story spoke to your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling stories that honor courage, compassion, and quiet faith. May God bless you, and may peace go with you always.